Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Summer of 1968. The scorching heat of Texas, the shimmering asphalt roads, and the quiet suburban neighborhoods. Jack Morrison stood in front of his house, tightly holding the enlistment papers in his hands. Just a few weeks earlier, at his high school graduation ceremony, he had been laughing with his friends, making plans for the future. Some were going to university, others would take over family businesses. But Jack was different. He had inherited a warrior's spirit from his father. His father's voice echoed in his mind. If you want to be a real man, you must fight for your country. His father had fought in the Pacific during World War II as a Marine. He would often talk about his war stories, his eyes gleaming with pride as he shared tales of heroism. Jack wanted to see that same light in his father's eyes. He dreamed of becoming a strong, fearless soldier just like him. Jack's mother, however, wasn't pleased with his decision. At the dinner table, trying to hide her tears, she said, "Son, you're still so young. This isn't your war." But Jack was determined. When he enlisted with his friends, his excitement had pushed aside any fear. He was going to serve his country and become a courageous soldier. After being accepted into the military, Jack was sent to Fort Jackson military training camp in South Carolina, along with other recruits. His first days were both physically and mentally challenging. The instructors trained the new soldiers with harshness and brutality. At 4:30 a.m., they were woken by the sound of a bugle. Still half asleep, they had to quickly make their beds, polish their shoes, and line up in 5 minutes. If anyone was slow, the entire team was punished. "You're not kids anymore. You're soldiers now. The enemy won't have mercy on you in Vietnam, and neither will we here," the drill sergeant yelled, spitting in their faces as Jack learned to use rifles, throw grenades, and fight in close combat. His body grew stronger and more resilient. But the training wasn't just physical, it was mental. They were being prepared to be soldiers in every sense. Their sergeant told them that they needed to kill their emotions. One night, while they were practicing ambush tactics, their sergeant suddenly shouted, "Morrison, what do you think war is like?" Jack paused for a moment before answering, "A place where we go to defeat the enemy, sir." The sergeant laughed harshly and squinted at him. "Defeat the enemy? No, Morrison. War is hell. There are no rules there. There are only survivors and the dead." A strange chill ran through Jack for the first time. He began to sense the true face of war at the end of their training. Jack and his unit received their certificates, confirming they were ready for battle. They were given a brief leave to visit home. When Jack returned to Texas, his mother hugged him tightly, while his father patted him on the shoulder, saying, "I'm proud of you, son." But Jack could see the fear and sadness in his mother's eyes. 2 days later, Jack boarded a large, gray bus to the airbase. Looking around, he realized that most of the soldiers sitting next to him were about his age. Some had trembling hands, while others joked around to appear brave. But there was a shared feeling among them. They were headed into the unknown. The bus ride was silent. As Jack looked out the window, he felt as if he was leaving behind the world he knew. The vast Texan landscapes, the old gas stations on the side of the roads, and the lights of the cities slowly faded away, replaced by an endless darkness. When they arrived at the airbase, Jack was ushered into a large cargo plane. The metal benches were hard, and the sound of the airplane's engines was deafening. His initial excitement gave way to a strange unease. A soldier sitting next to him broke the silence. "What do you think it'll be like over there?" Jack thought for a moment. The lessons from training camp, the words of his sergeant, his father's stories, and the news reports he had seen all flashed through his mind. "I don't know," he replied. As the plane took off, Jack felt a deep certainty. His life would never be the same. Ahead of him lay an unknown war, months filled with fear and death. And Jack now was a soldier. When Jack Morrison and his unit set foot on the soil of Vietnam, the first things that greeted them were the blazing sun and suffocating humidity. The tropical climate of Southeast Asia was a far cry from the dry heat of Texas. It was impossible to wipe the sweat off his skin. With every step, he felt it sticking to his uniform. As he looked around, he saw massive cargo planes and trucks carrying soldiers at the Da Nang Air Base, where American forces were stationed. The sky was clear and blue, but for Jack, this sight was more a harbinger of unknown fear than peace. "Hey, new kid," shouted an old sergeant. "What's your first impression? Like heaven, huh?" Jack didn't respond. The experienced soldiers around him didn't seem cheerful. Most were silent, their eyes lost in thought. No one seemed to want to be here. The camp smelled of sweat and gunpowder. When they boarded the trucks, Lieutenant Collins shot Jack a harsh look, taking a drag from his cigarette and saying, "Don't get attached, kid." Jack furrowed his brows. Attached? Here, friendships end in death. The fewer people you know, the less pain you'll feel. A knot formed in Jack's stomach. Would everything he'd learned in training matter here? What was real war like? Jack's unit was stationed near the enemy lines in the deep forests of Quang Trop, a region of Vietnam. Their mission was to observe the movements of Viet Cong guerrillas and detect possible attacks on their base. The base was a small area surrounded by makeshift tents and sandbags. When night fell, amidst the sounds of crickets and monkeys from a distance, the scent of unknown dangers from the depths of the forest filled the air. Most of the new soldiers were uneasy, but what scared Jack the most was the silence of the seasoned soldiers. The first patrol was a reconnaissance mission. They were to infiltrate a forest area where the enemy had been frequently spotted and checked for any activity. Jack was with Lieutenant Collins and several experienced soldiers. Everyone was silent, and the only sound was the crunch of their footsteps. Forest was dark and dense. Mosquitoes buzzed around them, and the humidity filled their lungs with every breath. The enemy could be anywhere. "If we don't see them before they see us, we die," Collins whispered. Jack's hands were sweaty, and he gripped his rifle tighter. When night fell, they decided to set up an ambush in the forest. As they silently waited between the trees, Jack's heart was pounding in his chest. The only sounds around him were the monotonous hum of the insects and the distant screech of an owl. Then, ... a branch snapped. Jack held his breath. A shadow stirred. As his eyes tried to adjust to the darkness, Collins whispered low, "Get ready." Just then, the silence was shattered by an explosion. With a sudden flash of light from the right, gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the air, and leaves scattered to the ground. The unit quickly took cover and returned fire. Jack's ears were ringing, and without understanding what was happening, he threw himself to the ground. "Contact! Contact! Take cover!" Collins shouted. Shaking, Jack raised his rifle, but his sweaty hands made it difficult to pull the trigger. In front of him he saw a figure blending into the shadows. He couldn't see the man's face, but the weapon was pointed at him, and then it happened. Jack instinctively pulled the trigger. The rifle recoiled and hit his shoulder. The man in front of him staggered as if hit. Then he collapsed to his knees. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The man's weapon fell to the ground. For a few seconds, that man had been alive just moments ago. Now he was dead. Jack's stomach churned. He felt like he was going to vomit, but couldn't. This wasn't a training exercise. This wasn't a game. This was real. That man was dead because of him. "Come on, Morrison. We're getting out of here," Collins shouted, pulling Jack by the arm. But Jack couldn't move. He was staring at the man he had killed. The expression on Collins' face hardened. "You never forget your first son, but you have to forget it." "Now move," Jack snapped out of it when he felt someone slap him. Collins was looking into his eyes. "If you want to survive, we're leaving now." Jack's mind was a whirlwind, but his feet moved involuntarily. They moved out of the firefight and back to the safe zone. When Jack returned to the base, his hands were still trembling. His eyes were vacant. He sat in a corner, placed his rifle on his knees, and tried to take deep breaths. After a while, Collins sat down next to him and offered a cigarette. Jack didn't take it. Collins shrugged. "If you hadn't killed that guy, he would have killed you. You need to understand that." Jack nodded, but the weight inside him didn't disappear. A part of his innocence had stayed behind in that forest. This war was much more brutal than he had ever imagined, and Jack was no longer the same person. Days in Vietnam turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Jack and his unit had been sent to the Ashau Valley, one of the most blood-soaked regions of the war. It was one of the areas where the Viet Cong was most active, and nearly every day there was a firefight. Jack had begun to forget the fear he had felt when he first stepped into the war. Death had become a new reality for him. Every patrol, every ambush, every sudden attack claimed a life or left someone wounded. The war slowly consumed him. In Jack's unit, no one talked much anymore. The young men who had once joked and laughed were now weary soldiers, smoking their cigarettes as if they were burning away their hopes. In every battle, they lost someone. In the early days, a kid named Henderson, just 19 years old, had lost his legs to a landmine during a patrol. His screams still echoed in Jack's ears. In another patrol, a soldier named Sanchez had been shot by Viet Cong snipers. With a single bullet to his head, he collapsed without even having the chance to say a word. What hurt Jack the most was finding a letter from Sanchez's family in his pocket. "Son, we're waiting for you. When you come home, we'll go fishing together," it said. Sanchez never made it home, but the loss that left the deepest wound in Jack's life was the death of his closest friend, Danny Walker. Danny had been Jack's best friend since their training camp days. He was always positive, cheerful, and brave. Jack used to tell him, "This war hasn't changed you one bit." Danny would always laugh and reply, "One of us still has to stay. Human, right?" But one day, everything changed. While on a reconnaissance mission near enemy lines, their unit suddenly came under heavy fire. Bullets rained down on them from the forest. There was no place to escape. Jack was trying to crawl into cover next to Danny when, suddenly, an explosion went off. Jack's ears rang. Smoke and dirt flew everywhere. At first he couldn't understand what was happening, but when his blurry eyes turned to Danny, Danny had been shot in the chest. Panicking, Jack crawled toward his friend. "Hold on, Danny. Hold on," he shouted. Danny's face was pale, struggling to breathe. His eyes were locked on Jack's. "Jack," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't leave me here." Jack cradled him in his arms, pressing his hand against the wound on Danny's chest. But the blood was too much to stop. "I'll get you out of here, just hang on. We'll call for an ambulance." But Danny gently shook his head. "Jack, go home. Make it through. I can't, but you have to." And then, the light slowly faded from Danny's eyes. Jack screamed. It was the first time he cried in the war. Danny had been like a brother to him. But now, his lifeless body lay in his arms. Collins pulled Jack by the shoulder. "Let's go. We have to leave him here," he said. But Jack couldn't move. He couldn't pull his hands away from Danny. "No, we can't leave him here," he yelled. But the war was ruthless. They couldn't wait any longer. Collins forcibly dragged him away. When Jack turned to look one last time, Danny's body lay there, alone. Danny's death left a deep wound in Jack's soul. He couldn't sleep at night. When he closed his eyes, he kept hearing Danny's last words over and over again. "Don't leave me here." He had left him. He had no other choice, but he had left him. Every night, he dreamed of the same scene. But sometimes it ended differently. Sometimes Danny was shouting at him, blaming him. Other times, Jack was the one who died. Instead of Danny, he grew more and more withdrawn. He no longer spoke much to his unit, the people he used to share everything with. Like every soldier living in the war, he soon started searching for ways to numb himself. Cigarettes weren't enough. Alcohol wasn't enough. He hadn't fallen into drugs like some of the other soldiers, but every sip of whiskey he drank at night allowed him to forget the pain, if only for a few minutes. But Danny's voice never stopped inside his head. Go home, make it through. Jack wanted to believe he could still survive. But a voice inside him kept telling him, the war won't bring you home. The war only takes every battle. He was dying a little more. Every day, he was slipping further away from being Jack Morrison. And now, his only hope was to survive this hell and make it back home. Jack Morrison returned to America in the fall of 1970, after the suffocating heat of Vietnam. Even the cool breeze of Texas felt foreign to him. As he got off the military plane, he looked around. There were people, some families holding signs to greet their loved ones, but no one came up to Jack to hug him. He didn't search for anyone either. The moment the war ended, the battle in his mind continued. Like most Vietnam veterans, Jack didn't find the welcome he had expected when he returned to America. People didn't support the war. News reports were broadcasting the horrors of the war in Vietnam, and seeing young men dying, the public cast hateful glances at soldiers. At the airport, a group of protesters was shouting, "Murderous soldiers, you killed the innocent." Jack's eyes instantly turned cold. A wave of anger surged within him, but he did nothing. He simply lowered his head and kept walking. He saw his father and mother waiting outside the terminal. His father, a World War II veteran, had thought his son would return as an honorable soldier. But the emptiness he saw in Jack's eyes deeply shook him. His mother hugged him, but Jack didn't even move. His father squeezed his hand, but Jack didn't respond. On the way home, no one spoke in the car. His mother glanced at him every now and then as if she wanted to say something, but didn't have the courage. Jack stared out the window, following the endless roads of Texas. When Jack got home, he entered his room. Everything was the same. The things from his childhood were still on the shelves, but he was no longer that child. The room no longer felt like it was his dot. Jack Morrison had died here. He couldn't sleep at night. When he closed his eyes, he went back to Vietnam, to that muddy forest, to the moments when his comrades were shot, to Danny's last words. The first night, when he woke up, he was soaked in sweat. The darkness of the room reminded him of a Viet Cong tunnel. He struggled to breathe. His hands were shaking. His whole body was ready for war. But this wasn't the front line. This was home, but he didn't feel like he belonged to this home. Jack tried to go outside, to do something, to mix with people, thinking it might help him forget the war. But things didn't go as he hoped. One day, he went to the city center. Walking down a crowded street, a car's exhaust backfired. Bang! Jack's body instinctively dropped to the ground. He tried to take cover by putting his hands over his head. His heart was pounding like crazy. He thought it was a Viet Cong ambush. But after a few seconds, when he looked around, he saw people staring at him in confusion. Children were hiding behind their mothers. A man laughed at him and said, "Hey, man, the war's over." Jack slowly stood up, dusted himself off. A moment ago, he could have sworn he was still at war. But this was Texas. He wasn't in the war anymore, but the war was still going on inside. Jack tried to meet up with old friends. A few people he had known since high school had gathered to say welcome home. They were sitting in a corner of a bar, drinking beer. "Come on, Jack, tell us. What was Vietnam like?" Jack looked at the beer in his hand. Where should he begin? Should he talk about the people he ate with, who were torn apart, the wounded soldiers screaming, or Danny dying? In his arms, he raised his eyes and looked at them blankly. It was hot and noisy, he simply said. One of his friends laughed. Wow, you haven't changed one bit. I'm buying you your first drink. But Jack had changed completely, and no one understood that. His mother tried to support him. She made his favorite meals, and even though they didn't talk about the war, she tried to be there for him. But Jack's biggest problem was his relationship with his father. When his father asked, "Did the war make you this weak?" Jack's insides boiled with anger. "Weak, Dad, the weak ones died. I survived, but I paid the price," he yelled. His father's eyes narrowed. "I fought too, but when I came home, I didn't make excuses." "Be a man, Jack." Jack gritted his teeth. In that moment, he wanted to attack his father. But he didn't. He just shook his head and walked out of the house. This house wasn't his anymore. He didn't belong anywhere. At night, he walked the streets. He drank to distract his mind, but even alcohol couldn't make him sleep. Sometimes he would spend the night in parks, sometimes sit in alleys staring at a wall for hours, doing nothing. He had made it out of Vietnam, but the war had killed him. The young Jack Morrison inside him was gone. In his place was a broken man left by the war. His eyes were empty. His soul was heavy. And the biggest question inside him was, is there a place for me in this world? For Jack Morrison, life was never the same after Vietnam. Since he returned from the war, it felt like he was stuck in a never-ending battle within his mind. Every night, he experienced the same nightmares, and due to insomnia, he wandered through the days completely drained. He had thought everything would get better once the war ended. But the greatest battle was only beginning. Fighting with his own mind, nights were the hardest for Jack. Every time he entered his room, the four walls felt like a bunker. When he closed his eyes, he was back in Vietnam. He was in the jungle. The enemy was lying in ambush. Gunfire was ringing out, and the smell of blood filled his nose. Gunshots, screams, then Danny's face, his friend, blinking for the last time. His hands were bloody. He was looking at Jack as if accusing him. Jack woke up with a scream. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His breathing was irregular. He got up and went to the bathroom. When he looked in the mirror, he saw the dark circles under his eyes. The war had aged him. His eyes now looked like the eyes of a dead man. He turned on the faucet, filled his palms with water, and splashed his face. But no matter what he did, he couldn't wash away Vietnam. Jack was trying to adapt to normal life, but it felt almost impossible. He applied for a few jobs. However, when he tried working in an office environment, the crowded rooms made him feel trapped. The sounds of hammers, keyboard clicks, and people talking loudly, ... They all echoed in his head, throbbing in his brain. After a while, the sounds of machine guns from Vietnam began to echo in his ears. One day he tried working as a waiter in a restaurant. The job was easy. Take orders, serve food, be polite with customers. But when a plate fell loudly inside the restaurant, Jack froze. He thought the Viet Cong were attacking. Jack dove to the floor when the table tipped over, his body instinctively taking a defensive position. He stayed on the floor for several seconds, waiting. When he looked around, he saw people staring at him in fear. His boss said, "You can't work here, Jack. This job isn't for you." Jack had only lasted 2 days on the job. After that, he stopped looking for work altogether. He began avoiding people, locking himself away in solitude. He was always on edge, like he had been in Vietnam. It felt as if there was an enemy lying in ambush around every corner. Jack began drinking. At first, he drank just to sleep. Then he started drinking to wake up. Alcohol temporarily freed him from his nightmares, but there was one problem. The nightmares didn't disappear. They were just postponed. When he drank, he could forget the past. But when he woke up with a headache and a stomachache, remembering it hurt even more. His relationships with friends had completely dissolved. His mother watched her son slowly wither before her eyes. His father no longer spoke to him. "Son, you died in the war," he had said one day. When Jack heard this, a deep emptiness filled him. Maybe his father was right. Jack Morrison had stayed in Vietnam. The person here was only his ghost. For Jack, the turning point came when he met a former soldier named Sam. One day, while sitting at the bar, an older man sat next to him. Sam was wearing an old military jacket. Jack immediately realized he was a Vietnam veteran. "I've seen many men like you, son," Sam said, taking a sip of his beer. "The war is over, but the war inside you still continues, doesn't it?" Jack squinted at him. "What do you know?" he grumbled. Sam just smiled. "I was just like you," he said. "When I came home, I went through the same thing. I woke up in the middle of the night in the war. I ran from people. I drank, did drugs, tried to destroy myself. But then I realized something. Jack, you can't live like this. If the war didn't kill you, you shouldn't kill yourself." Jack was silent for a moment. "Do you think this war will ever end?" he asked. Sam shook his head. "No, but you can learn to manage it." Then he lightly tapped Jack on the shoulder. "I joined a therapy group for this. Want to come with me?" Jack let out a mocking laugh. "Therapy? What good will that do?" Sam looked Jack straight in the eyes. "Can it be worse than it is right now?" Jack thought for a while. Then he lowered his head. Sam was right. He had nothing left to lose, Jack decided. To join Sam and go to a therapy group. When he entered the room, he saw many other former soldiers like him. There were veterans from the Korean War and those who had returned from Vietnam. At first, he didn't want to speak. He just sat there, listening to the others. One man said, "I can't sleep at night. I wake up every night to the sound of an explosion." When Jack heard this, he lifted his head. Another man said, "I feel lost when I try to mix with civilians." Jack briefly saw himself in him. They were all like him. They were all carrying the same war in their minds. Jack finally took a deep breath and began to speak. "I lost my best friend Danny in Vietnam," he said, his voice trembling. "I said something to him while I held him in my arms, but he didn't hear me. I think about him every night. I couldn't save him." The room fell silent. But no one judged him. No one looked down on him, because they all understood Jack. That day, something changed. For Jack, for the first time, he felt like he was able to share the burden of the war, even if just a little. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone, but the healing process would be long and difficult. Jack had been lost in the war, but maybe one day he would find his way back. For Jack Morrison, life was never the same after the war, but now he was beginning to accept that it shouldn't be. The scars of the war weren't going away, but he could learn to live with them. Therapy and support groups had given him the courage to face his trauma for years. He had lived as the young man in the war. Now it was time to rediscover who he truly was. As he continued with therapy, Jack started to see his past in a different light. He had once seen Danny's death as nothing but a failure. He blamed himself for not saving him. But over time, he realized that the war was something beyond his control. Everything he did in Vietnam was about survival. Like the other soldiers, he had come face to face with death, living in fear, and he had been one of the ones who survived. As Sam lit a cigarette, he turned to Jack and asked, "So, what are you going to do now?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know. A big part of my life was the war. I don't know how to be a normal person." Sam took a puff of his cigarette. "There's no such thing as normal, son. We're all fighting something different. But the things you learned in the war, you can still use them here." Jack furrowed his brows. "The things I learned." "Like what?" Sam smiled. "You learned to survive. You learned to be strong. You learned to protect people." Those things weren't for nothing, Jack. You just need to figure out how to use them. That day, Jack began to think he had survived. But now, he needed to find a way to truly live. Jack searched for jobs for a while, but found he couldn't see himself in offices or restaurants. He felt like he needed to do something completely different. So, he turned to volunteer work. One day, he was invited as a speaker at a veteran support group. In the hall, there were many other soldiers like him. Some were from the Korean War, some from Vietnam, and some had returned from the Gulf War. They all had the same pain in their eyes. Jack walked up to the podium. As he looked at the crowd, he paused for a moment. Then, taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "My name is Jack Morrison. I'm a Vietnam veteran. When I came home, the war was over, but it wasn't over for me. For years I felt lost. I blamed my friends, I blamed myself. I turned to alcohol. But then I realized that surviving isn't just about breathing. Surviving means not letting the war completely take you over." The audience listened in silence. "I'm here today because someone helped me. They showed me a way out. If you're still carrying the war in your mind, know that you're not alone. And you don't have to fight this war by yourself." When he finished his speech, there was a brief silence. Then a man from the audience stood up and came over to Jack, shaking his hand. "Thank you," he said. "I needed to hear that." At that moment, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Jack continued to volunteer and support other war veterans for years. He listened to their stories and shared his own. And every time, he realized once again that the best way to heal the wounds of war was not to hide them, but to face them. One day, he was sitting on the beach. He had his feet buried in the sand and was looking at the waves of the ocean. The ocean was vast and free. He was far away from the humid jungles of Vietnam, but the past was always with him. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought of Danny. In the past, every time he remembered him, guilt would fill him. But now, he remembered Danny's smiling face. He was young, full of life, and brave. Jack knew that to honor his memory, he needed to live, not destroy himself. When a seagull cried out, there was peace within him. He was no longer an old soldier. He was a man who had survived.